Good morning, everybody that I can see on the screen and all the attendees that I don't have the pleasure of seeing, and welcome. My name is Stephanie Mora. I'm the Division Director for Wetlands and Waterways at MassDEP. Addressing resilience to a changing climate is an important priority for the entire department. Our division's efforts to update both the wetlands regs and the Chapter 91 waterways regulations is a reflection of that departmental priority. I want to thank each of you today for participating in this dialogue to help shape the resilience updates to Chapter 91 regulations. Your particular perspective, expertise, experience is a really important part of this conversation, and we welcome your input to help shape this reg update. I also want to just briefly acknowledge the importance of good leadership at MassDEP. And so kudos to our Assistant Commissioner, Kathy Baskin of the Bureau of Water Resources, and all the folks in the Commissioner's Office who really have provided the leadership to help move forward with these important regulatory updates. And also a very important shout out to acknowledge the hardworking efforts of Daniel Pageant and his entire waterways team here to get us where we are today and to take this through to fruition. So with that, again, I just thank you all for your time and your participation, your input and your ideas, and I look forward to the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Stephanie. So I'd like to recognize a few additional members of the DEP team that are here today. We have Chrissy Hobbs, who's the Assistant Director for the Waterways Program. I think many of you know Chrissy. We also have Frank Taramina. Frank is a Senior Regional Planner, unless I just promoted him. Susan Yu and Alice Doyle are, Alice Doyle is also a Regional Planner, and Susan Yu is a Environmental Analyst. There are other members of the Waterways team here. I think I saw Hannah Reardon, who is our Program Coordinator, Yvonne Morales, who is a Environmental Analyst, Jerome Graff, also Regional Planner, and that's the Boston team. I didn't see others. So all those folks are here. Some of them are participating today. Some of them are here to keep up like everybody else. Also, we have here, I'm not sure if Stephanie mentioned already, we have Pam Harvey here. Pam has served in the department for many years, is semi-retired now. We are fortunate to have her, have been working with her on these potential updates. And we may hear from her today if need be. She may sit in the audience and if we need her. All right. So with that, I have a brief presentation, brief slideshow. It's not too many slides, and then we will get into the panel discussion on this. Okay. The department's been working on this for a while. We've been thinking about this for a while. This has come in several iterations over the years. It is time for us to start moving this ball forward, as Stephanie mentioned. In order to do that, we have gathered together panelists, and you all can see the panelists who are here today. We couldn't have everybody on the panel, so we selected individuals and entities and organizations that we thought could help us frame the conversation, help us move this forward in a technical way, and frankly, there are plenty of individuals and organizations who have put a lot of effort into this topic, a lot of effort into planning, a lot of effort into bringing this topic to the fore, and we've written reports and have done all kinds of things. And it's very important to us that we not start from scratch. Why would we go back to square one? We want to take advantage of the skills and the efforts and the work that those people have done. And some of those folks are here in this room. And you see on the slide, that's what we tried to our universe of panelists came from those groups. Both, it's important that we recognize there are both water dependent type projects and non-water dependent. And it's important that we have representation from both of those worlds. So, and anyone who wanted to attend is available, is welcome to attend. And there are, I can't see how many now, but that looks like there's maybe 20 people from the non-panelist world. This is a quick snapshot of the agenda we're going to go through today. That's 70-minute chunk. That's a big chunk. Fortunately, if anybody has to step away, there's plenty of people to keep this moving. We will take a break in a moment there. I am going to, what's going on here? There we go. We're going to run through several topics today. The point of this is to identify near-term changes we need to consider for the regulations. There are a universe of changes in theory that we need to make, we could talk about, we could explore. Some of those will take longer and require a deeper dive, more conversation, some give and take. It is our intention today to talk about, to seek your input on some of the perhaps shorter conversations, so that we can affect some changes in the near term, changes that prevent us from discouraging climate resiliency adaptation, right? We'd like to the extent that we're able to, create opportunity in the regulations for good planning, for good adaptation. Okay. We will deal with the larger, longer term items as well. Excuse me. I may have skipped the slide, sorry. Today I want to focus on these. However, there will be an opportunity towards the end of this session to identify items that need to be on that longer term list. If those items come up during our conversation, these items, we're going to politely say, thank you very much. That's on the list. We're going to put that on the list and we will return to that. To the extent those items may touch on these as well, we'll find a compromise space there. Okay. So there are seven items that we hope to go through today. Okay, I'm going to flip through them briefly, and then we're going to stop and we're going to go through each one in detail and seek your input and kind of spur a conversation. Okay.
Hey, Daniel.
Yes, Stephanie.
Pardon me for interrupting. Just one quick context thing that I think we might have glossed over is there's a slide up above that just describes roughly when we're thinking both the wetlands and the Chapter 91 package. Yeah, there you go.
I did skip that.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
It just might help for context.
Yes,
Thank you.
Thank you. And we agonized over this slide yesterday and the day before and the day before that. So good of us to skip that important slide. So I'm not going to read the slide. The point of this is to have some Chapter 91 regulation changes happen around the same time or at the same time as the water quality and wetlands regulatory changes. So that's the timing of this. We're hoping to have draft to take your input to work on amendments to the regulations, and then issue draft regs in the spring, this coming spring, for public comment. There'll be a hearing, maybe there'll be two, I don't know, and then to issue final regs in the fall for these near-term items. Okay, Stephanie, thanks for bringing me back to that slide. Okay. Here's the first item. Again, I'm going to flip through all these, then we're going to go back and we're going to start talking about them. Engineering construction standards. This is, you can see the main point right here. The regulations currently tell us to look back to historic sea level rise. Well, that's great, but that paradigm doesn't work any longer. We need to be looking forward to projected sea level rise, I think everyone in this room will agree with that. We're going to talk about we'd like to talk about how we might do that, and what types of language we might want to use to accomplish that. Okay. The next is we want to talk a little bit about building height, and how some of those provisions might be modified. Now, this is intended, again, to get out of the way of owners who wish to affect good climate adaptation strategies, moving switchgear off the first floor, something like that. I look forward to folks reminding me that putting utilities on the roof doesn't necessarily increase building height, but that's the kind of conversation we want to spur. The next is expiration. There it is, right on the slide. What happens when a license expires and wants to be renewed? There are many, many licenses coming up. This is a business call for everyone. There are many licenses coming up for renewal, in the next 10 years, and then further. And we need to be ready to deal with that in the context of sea level rise and climate change. That's what we want to talk about. While many of the folks, maybe, I don't know, that we have panelists here and attendees focus on some of the larger projects in downtown Boston, downtown whatever, large non-water dependent use projects. As some of you know, the waterways universe is not limited to those areas. There are innumerable simplified licenses that have been issued for small residential docks. So that's a bit of a universe right there. And we need to be able to provide the opportunity for those licensees to have some ability to modify their docks and piers if necessary to respond to sea level rise. So we're going to talk about that. I think many of you have heard me talk about one of my favorite sections of the regulations, which talks about extended term licenses. And there are, I'm not going to list them, there are 3 or 4 different items that the regulations require an applicant to submit to justify an extended term license. And of course, my favorite part, other relevant factors. We have considered that all of the other relevant factors since I came on board anyway, probably before, to consider climate-driven sea level rise. So we'd like to have that not be a guessing game for someone who just lands here in Massachusetts and wants to work on this kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about clarifying that. Minor modifications. We open the topic of minor modifications very cautiously. We want to talk about how this provision might be suitable to affect small changes in buildings. Again, in this example, allow building systems to be moved off the ground floor. Okay? And I know some folks are probably thinking, I moved them off the ground floor. What can I do with that space on the ground floor? Don't make me get an amendment. That's the conversation we want to have. And then lastly, we want to talk about consistency amongst the regulations with regard to coastal high hazard velocity zone, so that there's consistency with the Wetlands Regulations, Chapter 91, and the Building Code. And that'll be a lot of fun. So it's 10:30, pretty close to schedule, shockingly. Okay. engineering construction standards, sea level rise. Currently, the regulations refer to historic sea level rise. That's a little bit of an open item, right? We don't want to be looking to historic sea level rise. No, we don't want to look only to historic sea level rise. We need to look to the future too. I want to note that that the FEMA regulations, right? The FEMA regs require by federal statute that they look to the past, not the future. That's really not what we want to be doing. So, who would like to start?
If any panelists want to voice their question or comment, just raise your hand and we'll call on you in order. You can also put questions in the chat and we can call on you that way as well.
I think
And
Deanna
I
Moran was
asked
the first
Jamie
one.
to unmute.
Right.
Mifei is,
Okay. So thank you, Daniel. I mean, this I think is a pretty reasonable goal for the program. And can you hear me? Yes. Okay. This seems like a reasonable goal for the program. It's, the work that we're doing. We're pretty much considering this anyway as we go forward, as I think most proponents are, not necessarily because of Chapter 91, but due to a wide variety of other programs that are applicable, everything from building code to zoning, so forth. I think the only highlighted concern I would have is how we figure out what is the right projected sea level rise, because as I think all of you know, for any given location, there are multiple agencies that have projected sea level rise, and they're all over the place, and there's high level projections and moderately high level and moderate projections. So I think the challenge here is to understand what the right tool is to do your projection and have some consistency throughout the state on what that is. And I sat on the panel for, I'm still sitting on the panel with the Board of Building Regulation and Standards addressing this very same issue in the state building code, and it would be helpful to have some consistency in the state building code on that issue. Thank you.
I was having a slightly tough time hearing you, Jamie. Did folks catch that? Okay.
yes.
So I'm not going to interject at every moment, I promise. I think Jamie raises a good point. I think that it's important to recognize the life of a project. There is a vast difference between, let's say, a large non-water dependent use project on the Fort Point Channel that will be there for a very long time, or a residential dock, or a I don't know, boat yard that might be more flexible because in the summer all those boats are on the water and there's opportunities for adjustments, etc. But license terms vary greatly. Can we go to Deanna Moran?
Okay, next up in order, we have Deanna Moran, then Rick Domino, then Chip Nyland.
Great, thank you. My question is about this second bullet. I just want to make sure I'm understanding what is intended by this. So are you saying that if a proponent was using municipal or state sea level rise projections to identify the future floodplain, that they would then be required to comply with flood resistant construction standards in the state building code for floodplains? Because that's very different than what's required now. Right now, the state building code only requires flood resistant construction standards in the FEMA special flood hazard areas. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding what's kind of being proposed here.
so we're not looking to, well, I get, this is so we don't have draft regulations to share. So we want to figure out how to look at sea level rise in the context of anything that we're licensing. Some things, some docks, they're going to be in the velocity zone. It's just the way it is.
Right. So right now, if they're in a FEMA designated coastal, A zone, velocity zone, they're under the building code being required to comply with flood resistant construction standards. It is one of the things that's on the table that DEP would be interested in having proponents comply with those flood resistant construction standards for forward-looking floodplains. And I'll just put out there, I think that's something we would be extremely supportive of. I just am trying to understand if that's kind of the intent of this, because you say rely on building code for construction and floodplain. And I guess the question is that the current floodplain, which is already required, or is it the future floodplain? Because that would be a pretty significant change, again, that we would be very supportive of, just trying to make sure that there's clarity there.
So I think that we want to be looking forward, right? We want to be looking to, if a non-water dependent use project, for instance, they're building they want to put a building there, and that building is going to be there for 50 years, then that we want that building to be designed and the site to be designed recognizing projected sea level rise. A few months ago, we were in a discussion on this very topic of how long what should the term of a license be for a project. It was in Boston, and we asked, what are you doing about sea level rise? What are you doing about projected increases? And they were not able to give us anything that went beyond the Climate Ready Boston 2070 estimate. And we issued we were going to issue a 49-year license. We ended up rounding that to 50, but we limited the duration of that license because it was not able to deal with anything beyond the projected 2070 sea level rise. So if it's a non-water dependent use project, we need to, it's my opinion, that we need to be looking to what the projected sea level rise is, and that should be how that's how we should deal with finished floor elevations and things like that. Again, I want to recognize that water dependent use structures, some of them, someone's going to build a modest size pile supported structure. Perhaps it's not lifted all the way up above projected sea level rise for 2070 to look at the life of the structure. So,
okay, that's helpful. I think we're on the same page about the general intent, and I understand that there aren't draft regulations at this point. I would just, flag that for this, and I can follow up offline, but I would just flag for this particular change that if you're really going to be getting into the interface with the state building code, there's like a lot of technical considerations here. So I would just encourage a little bit of thought and strategy around that, but I'm happy to follow offline about that.
thank you, Dina.
Thank you. All right, Rick Camino, then Chip.
Thank you. And again, very appreciative of you all organizing this and asking us to engage in this discussion. We're pleased that you're considering updating the Chapter 91 regulation. And there's been numerous kind of relationships to the questions of sea level rise and climate impacts that have come up relative to the Chapter 91 regulations and municipal harbor planning. And for a long time, it's kind of been more informal and ad hoc, because obviously the Chapter 91 regulations had more prescriptive understandings regarding impacts of shadow and height and water dependent uses, facilities of public accommodation, and less kind of prescriptive approaches regarding the impacts of sea level rise and inundation. So this is a topic that definitely warrants some additional consideration. But I would be interested in learning kind of how you would want to relate this regulation to actions that either cities would need to take or real estate developers would need to take. We kind of know now what the challenges are associated with shadows or water sheet impacts, et cetera. You know, as you know, some municipalities, let's take Boston, for example, are developing resiliency guidelines within their development review processes. There's also some updating that's going on regarding floodplains. So I guess I'm interested in how it would relate to what steps both cities and developers would need to take once that forward level projected sea level rise was being considered, and trying to make sure that whatever we're doing, it's consistent with municipal strategies and also not overly onerous and also not confusing regarding the various regulatory agencies that would have some roles, so that we're not asking either cities or developers to kind of either pick or choose or to kind of make progress on one aspect of this, but not make progress because of another jurisdiction is saying you haven't gone far enough. I mean, how can we make sure that we're both using the right standards, both from a state and city standpoint regarding the projected sea level rise notion, and then how do we make sure that when we're doing what we can do appropriately, but not getting basically barraged by multiple jurisdictions or too many different things that need to get figured into how to address this thing, and how prescriptive will it be. And that relates again to this question of the construction of the floodplain question that was being asked previously. I know that's kind of a general question and a comment, but I guess I'm highlighting some of my concerns regarding this. I mean, for the moment, we've just been dealing with this on a case-by-case basis within the municipal harbor plan and trying to be proactive. And I got to give, in terms of the city, some credit relative to kind of thinking through resiliency regarding the most recently submitted municipal harbor plan. But I kind of wanted to get a sense of where you're headed with this and what the regulatory and requirements might be.
So we, Rick, I said everyone, so we're not gonna be able to answer every question. We're not gonna be able to. I am going to try to respond to your question, but this is a bit of a trying to have this be a listening session. I'll tell you what our thoughts are on this. That we've got 7 items we want to try to get through. So I'm going to try to respond to Rick's question. I would like to be able to foster some discussion rather than DEP sitting here and you guys asking us, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? I would like to be able to draw upon the huge amount of knowledge and experience in this virtual room. That's why we brought you all together. I'm inclined to say, what does anybody think about that? But I'm going to, because it was directed at us, I'm going to ask that. I'm going to try to answer that. Rick, you raise a very good point. It's, there's the city of Boston, props to Chris Bush and all the people over there, the only Boston person I see. and the people at the city, Climate Ready Boston, the folks who have helped that they've, they really moved the ball forward. And I know others on this call have contributed to that, many of you. The one thing we know about the study of sea level rise is the science changes, the estimates change, the report changes, the name of the standard changes. And I am loath to insert language into the Chapter 91 regulations that's going to need to be revised 6 months from now. If I name a standard, that's just the perfect guarantee that there's going to be a new one in October or December. So we want to create language that is sufficiently flexible to recognize that the science will change, and that while Boston is focus is, seems to be really the focus of how this is being done at the municipal level, New Bedford, Fall River, etc., Somerville, they're all gonna catch up, and I'm not gonna make Fall River and New Bedford, or it would be a mistake, I think, to make Fall River and New Bedford use the solution that was developed for Boston. Things may be learned, may be common, etc. I think we need to maintain enough flexibility that we can make the right decision, do the right thing, to be able to regulate development in these areas as time goes on. I don't want to have to update these regs every year. So we're trying to come up with a way to be flexible in that and not impose a standard from one municipality that's too disparate from what another one might need.
Dan, I think the point regarding flexibility is really a good one. And again, if I was to give some perspective regarding my experience with this, as it pertains to the kind of track record regarding questions of resiliency so far regarding Chapter 91, because there hasn't been as much prescriptive references to it, but certainly well-intended people both in the Boston side as well as the community of organizations that are on this call, we've taken it up. But I would say that flexibility has been actually really helpful, because we've been able to bring in both the expertise of the development community and their related consultants in the municipalities and find some decent solutions. So I would, even without having this getting as much attention in terms of the existing Chapter 91 regulation. So I guess one principle, I guess, in terms of considering these regulation updates would be flexibility. And that's, I guess, a good point that you made that I wanted to just amplify.
Thank you. Stephanie Krull, what could you add to this particular topic?
Daniel, I want to just be mindful of not jumping too many hands, but
Yeah, I was going to say,
I'm
I
sorry.
think
I'm sorry. You know
Chip,
what?
Chris,
Sorry,
and
my bad.
Anastasia are ahead of me.
I forgot. Sorry, my bad. I just know that this is I'm sorry. It was a conversation that
yeah,
you all know I'm an information gatherer, and I don't hesitate to pick up the phone to call any of you. And it turns out I picked up the phone to call and talk to Stephanie about this over the years. So I'm very sorry. Chip, my bad.
So usually when I raise well, first of all, thank you very much for including us. Usually when I raise my hand, by the time you get to me, my question is, passé. But in this instance, I'm thinking along the lines that Rick is. One of the items that you didn't include was 310 CMR 9.33. I mean, it seems to me that the department and the program has been able to stay away from these kinds of questions because you leave it for other agencies to take care of. And the one thing that when we talk about principles, the one thing we don't want to do is to have Chapter 91 setting a different standard than others. 9.33, for those that don't have it in front of you, requires you to be in compliance with all other environmental statutes and regulations. I'm thinking, it includes MEPA, it includes the Wetlands Protection Act. So I'm wondering, to the extent that perhaps we add the building code to it, so that you don't have the concern that you raised, Daniel, which is if you put a standard in, you're going to have to change it continually. But if instead you reference those regulations and statutes that pertain to the construction of your projects, then you don't have to change them. And the only question is, do we have enough of them in? I do recall, and I know that the city of Boston, for instance, they have land subject to coastal storm regulations that they're almost complete with, that are very innovative and flexible. And when anyone is signing off and submitting a Chapter 91 application, you have to have a check off from the municipal planning organization. So I think you can take care of that flexibility. I want to argue that we shouldn't be installing new standards and getting into new issues that are being decided by others and will take you away from your mission in terms of having, projects that, promote the interests of Chapter 91.
Okay.
So my vote is to keep it simple, and so that you don't have to keep coming back.
Thank you, Chip. I've been following the city's progress through that. I'm not fully versed in what those are, although I'm not afraid to ask for detail when an applicant says we comply with that. There, without getting into detail on the merits of any particular provision of that, something we've not yet figured out yet how to deal with, but something needs to be thought about is how, for example, how large non-water dependent use projects in areas prone to flooding. What about the garages under there? So that's something that needs to be thought about, and right now it's on a case-by-case basis, but we need to be able to, we can't ignore that, because I think that's a potential difficulty.
Well, I think a case-by-case basis, just to finish it off, I think that's Rick's other point, is you want that flexibility by tying yourself to the municipalities instead of having one standard that addresses both urban and non-urban areas. I think I would caution you not to go, take that route, but to make sure to incorporate the way that the individual communities are regulating activities within their boundaries.
Okay. I'm watching the clock. I don't usually do that.
So we have 3 hands still up on topic number 1.
All right. Well, so sometimes I can't shut up. I will admit that. Now I have it on tape. I guess we have, I'd like to keep the comments a little bit bracketed, maybe, so we can. There are lots of topics, and I'd like your input on lots of all of them. So, Stephanie, who's next?
We got Chris Bush is next, then Anastasia, and then Barbara Landau.
Okay, and after Barbara, we're going to move on to the next topic. So that's my plan. Chris.
Great. Well, thanks, Daniel, and to DP and the Waterways Program for getting this conversation going. This is really great. Just a couple of quick questions, comments with regard to 9.37 and the reference to historic sea level rise. The current regs just apply that to new buildings for non-water dependent use. Is that correct? I mean, if that's the case, I think it may make sense to look into expanding how that's applied to, public access infrastructure, flood resilient infrastructure as well. I know that there are coastal and shoreline engineering structure provisions within that, maybe looking at if we want, those sea level rise numbers to relate to those other structures that are out there. As part of this, I think we also need to look at the new RMAT, provisions to the MEPA process, which are utilizing the Mass Coastal Flood Risk Model, and what implications that has on project review and how that can inform sea level rise. And it's just the whole sea level rise numbers are tricky. I mean, even in Boston, we've got, certain design flood elevations for buildings for the coastal protective infrastructure we're looking to advance, we typically have higher numbers related to those components because they're building in, more energy, wave action, storm surge components. So just some items to consider. Thanks.
Chris, thanks for bringing that up. I think that that is our intent, is to consider a wide universe of structures that are buildings and structures that require licensing under Chapter 91. Nobody wants a seawall that's going to get overtopped and cause a problem. I think Anastasia was next.
Hi, everyone. Anastasia Nicolau here on behalf of NAOP, joined by many members today, and we're thrilled. Thank you for having us. Just to highlight one point that Jamie made earlier, and I know, Stephanie, you said not everyone heard it, so I think it's worth repeating, but consistency is just as important as flexibility. We need to know where these projections are coming from, how they're being peer reviewed, and ideally, it would all come from one place, and a developer, project proponent would be able to move forward knowing exactly what material they need to use. If it were to be set by the municipality, some sort of third-party peer review process or something that makes sure that these maps are not make sure these maps are accurate, correct to what we know, obviously understanding that could change. And I would also recommend, if any of these projections are included as a standard, though, of course, we agree with Tripp that it seems like there's a simpler way to do this. There is a consistent time period at which point those would be updated. So they're not updated every 6 months. Obviously, a licensing process can take much longer than that. So the predictability of having some set time period on how these projected sea level rise numbers and maps come into being, whether it be 3 years, 5 years, mandatory reviews, however that works, just something to consider to ensure there is predictability for the development community moving forward, and they aren't going to have to update any kind of applications, in any kind of inconsistent way.
Okay, thank you, Anastasia. It is, I'll tell you right now, it is not our intention to name a particular report, a particular standard. I mentioned that flexibility previously. We want to use the best science that's there, maybe not the newest, but the best, and that is a complex question, no doubt. So I understand the need for certainty in commercial real estate development. I'm well aware of that. Barbara?
Hi, I'm Barbara Landau, an attorney with Noble Wicker Sham and Hart. And just quickly, because I know you want to move on, the number of state regulations are going through revisions and addressing sea level rise issues. And it would be helpful if there was coordination among the agencies to get some consistency in the standards that are being selected. It would be a shame to have things end up in different places. It would be add-on to have some flexibility at the local municipal level. The other point I wanted to just highlight is that the concerns in Boston are very different from, say, the concerns on Cape Cod. And having just finished working on a project on the Cape, I'm aware that a big concern there is to allow the migration of wetland resources. And that would have a very different result than some of the things we're looking at in Boston, which is completely built up. And I think as we go through this, it would be helpful just to keep the broad interests of the state in mind.
Barbara, thank you. I appreciate that. I will let you know, and anyone else know, that I chased Stephanie's predecessor in this position, Weldon Langley, for many years on a particular project that was stepping back on a barrier beach, removing lots of stuff. So dynamic solutions and those kinds of systems are incredibly important. I am a fan of coastal geology, and I have Rebecca Haney's number on speed dial. So thank you for bringing that up. Rebecca Haney's as a coastal geologist at CZM, if anyone doesn't know that. So, she'll have lots of phone calls today. All right, so let's move to the next topic if we go. Thank you all for that. So I've been reminded, and I want to remind all of you, we're looking for your input. This is not the only opportunity for your input. Please you all know how to get a hold of me. Please send us some written comments, send us some written suggestions, send us what you think the universe ought to look like in the Chapter 91 regs. Send us anything you'd like. We really do want to hear what everybody has to say. And we'd like to do it, in the next couple of months rather than once we put out draft regulations. So we are asking for folks to, if they'd like to submit something in writing, you please try to get it to us by February 25th, which is 3 weeks, I think, 2.5 weeks. Of course, something shows up the next week, we're not going to ignore it. So anyway, so having said that, I'm going to move to the next slide. Do that. There we go. Building height. We're looking for ways to facilitate, very specifically, ways to facilitate moving building systems up on the roof. Somebody if it's in a build, I suspect this is mostly non-board dependent use projects. If a building has this switchgear on the ground floor, it's very expensive to move it. It's more expensive to replace it. So we're looking for, we're planning to add some flexibility to this to allow switchgear, for instance, to be moved to the roof. And I know that if that, having had the discussions about, does that mechanical level on the penthouse, does that count as a floor or not? Having had those discussions numerous times, I know that if it's put up there and it's not in an enclosure, it does not have any potential for adding to, quote, building height as described in zoning, at least in Boston zoning. We want to make sure we have sufficient flexibility here. What if that switchgear has to be put in an enclosure? How do we deal with that? So that's what we're looking at. Who'd like to start? You all just love this idea. Oh, Jamie. Hey, I guess Jamie. Go ahead, Jamie. What do you think?
Dan, this is a great thing to have up for discussion. I think and others know that this has been an issue, probably more at the local level than at the Chapter 91 level, but certainly they're kind of related. I would point out that your first bullet there, which says building height is defined by local zoning, is technically not correct, right? There is no definition of building height on your regulations, and no reference to local zoning in your reference. So that might be a good thing to start with. I don't disagree that that's how it should work. But I think the issue here is not only relocation. I would hope the issue is not just relocation of supporting building systems to the roof, but also elevating buildings above grade to meet flood zone standards. And I think actually probably a more important issue to include as well, so that somebody who is building along the coast and is trying to adapt to a future sea level rise that might be 3 feet or 4 feet higher than what it is today and wants to elevate their building, if they're trying to do a 5-story building and it's a 55-foot height limit under Chapter 91, and they have to lift their ground floor, 3, 4, 5 feet above grade, they can lose an entire floor. So I would hope that you would add that to the discussion about this point as well.
Thank you. The topic of, do we raise the ground floor, do we raise the zero, right? That's really, that might be the solution, right? Raise the zero to the top of the sea level,
Building height, right? Building height is a combination of where you measure from and where the top of the building is, and those two definitions are sort of key. So if you're measuring from first floor elevation and at 55 feet, you can get 5 stories in, that's fine. But if you're measuring from grade, and grade is 4 or 5 feet below your first floor elevation, then it can become problematic.
Are there any of our friends from MassDEP on the line recognizing the difference between height and elevation? There is you know, there is some flexibility in the regulations now, Jamie, to allow for what you're asking. We want to we're looking for ways to clarify it. So I don't really need to hear from MassDEP. I didn't see who was next here. Deanna or Rick?
I think it was me. I just want to follow up on Jamie's question. I think to Jamie's point and the kind of lack of definition in the regs, I think it would be really helpful to think about adding a definition for design flood elevation with an allowance for freeboard that considers future sea level rise. Again, that kind of ties back to the earlier conversation we had about how you determine which projections you use and kind of what that allowance is. But I do, you know, think that in some ways that conversation is a little bit separate from this conversation about relocating mechanicals. There's kind of one issue around how do you determine what the design flood elevation is and what kind of the allowance for sea level rise and freeboard is. And then a separate conversation about how tall can you go if you're going to relocate mechanicals to a higher floor, to the roof. And I would just say, I think you're right. There are instances where that doesn't really add a lot of height. I think there are other instances where it can potentially add a lot of height. We've seen that with lab spaces. They have really intense mechanicals, and to put all of that on the roof can add some pretty significant height. So I would just say, I think in the context of that conversation, we should think a little bit about, you know, how we deal with those two things separately and whether or not there is kind of a maximum cap on height in certain areas, especially for issues like mechanicals. But I think a definition would be helpful
Hey,
here.
it's Rick.
Kind of thinking about those two issues a little bit separately would be helpful.
Thank you, Deanna. By height, I was referring to the top of the highest occupied floor rather than the actual top of structure.
Right, and that's why the mechanicals is a little bit different from the design flood elevation issue, because when you start talking about mechanicals, you're getting above the highest occupiable floor.
Right. Two different topics, you're right. Okay. Anybody else have their hand up? Anyone else want to jump in on this?
Rick had his hand up, but I think he had to take a call.
Looks like it for now.
All right.
Yep.
All right. Deanna, thanks for the good comments. In addition to written comments, you know, get those folks want to put something in writing and then reach out to us and say, did you see what I mean? You get it? That would be fine. And Deanna, you and I have plenty of opportunity to interact. So certainly that can be one. And I'm not going to say see you in court. Oh, did I say that? Sorry. It's just a joke. How do I get over here? Trying to move to the next slide. Here we go. Okay, extended term licenses. Yeah, so the part about being my favorite section of the regulations is sort of the quote other relevant factors. You know, that really provides some flexibility for the department to consider other stuff, other information, and I've always thought that really to be the and a bit of an open opportunity for the department to consider sea level rise with regard to non-water dependent use projects and how high things are, and you know, how is it designed? Some of you may know I have pushed certain projects that are in the pipeline now to provide flexibility in their burn, if you will, in their separation from the water. What happens in 2070? Do you have the opportunity to raise that? And I realize that's a long way off, but is there some mechanism? Is the protective structure engineered in such a way that you take the top course off and put a new one on top, something like that? So those are just an example of the quote other relevant factors and how we deal with that. So we're thinking about two things. We're thinking about, instead of just saying other relevant factors, adding sea level rise to that, projected sea level rise. And again, that will have to be tied back into what the standard is, what the report is, the standard that shall not be named kind of thing. That's one. The second thing is we want to be clear that that any license term that exceeds 30 years would have to consider sea level rise. So those are the things that we're thinking about. So is Stephanie the one who's next now? Seems like she might be.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I just want to caution you to make sure that when you say that sea level rise must be considered, that when the department actually considers it, that they do it in a consistent way. And that this doesn't mean that you must build today for sea level rise for future conditions, that instead you allow flexibility in adapting to future conditions over time, because projects don't take place in a vacuum. And a lot of times there can be difficulties between adapting a site today and requiring that to be built to a higher sea level rise level, and impacts on adjacent properties. And so CZM would come in and say, hey, can you show us that you're not having flood impacts on adjacent properties? And then you're saying, but under Chapter 91 or under some other regulation, I'm being required to build this today, and I can't, take that into account. So I think just realizing that there's context around every development, and that sometimes it's not just that developers or agencies don't want to build or it's too expensive, but that it actually isn't really practicable and it's not actually the best solution. So just when the agency considers sea level rise, it should also be considered in the context of the physical environment around the project.
I think it's a very good point. I do recall a famous project out in the Cape and Islands where we established a monitoring phase. So the thing was built. We may have to step it back someday. We have to raise it someday. It was built in it could be built in such a way that it's good for today. It's good for the next 20 years. But things are going to move. The coastline's going to move landward. And then there's a monitoring phase, a design phase, and an action phase. So I think something like that might. And I don't want to build that into the regulations, but we need to think about that as well. I think you're right. You don't want to have you want to build a giant structure to protect somebody for this project for the next 100 years, and then you've got a problem immediately next door. Yeah, that's a good point. Deanna, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So I want to start by saying in 2019, I'm sure you remember this, Dan, and a few others do. CLF put out a report looking pretty deeply at what we thought changes need to be made to Chapter 91 regulations to accommodate climate change, and license terms are one of the kind of areas that we very deeply dug into. So I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think I agree with Stephanie to a certain extent. I want to echo something that Jamie put in the chat, which is I do think that we should be thinking about license terms in the context of the design life of the project and whatever the projected sea level rise that was used in accordance with that design life. One thing that I think we really worry about is this idea of extended term licenses, especially to the extent that the department is issuing, 95, 99-year licenses. That may have made sense in a world where everything was static and nothing was changing. I think it's extremely hard to do that with the amount of uncertainty that we have for what the future will look like. I think it's really hard to give a project, especially a non-water dependent use project, like a residential or commercial property, a 99-year license, not expect that they're going to design to that 99-year term. And honestly, they might not be able to. We just don't know with absolute certainty what the world will look like 99 years from now, and not have an option to go back and kind of rethink that. And I know, Steph is saying like, we should be thinking about it in terms of their adaptive capacity. I agree with that in theory, but I think a lot of developers are coming in looking for that longer term license for financing or whatever other reasons. And they're probably not going to be around in 95 or 99 years. And they might not really be, strategically thinking about what the adaptive capacity of the project really is over that term, or how expensive it would be to adapt the property over that term. I mean, if they're saying, in 90 years, if our properties can be flooded, we'll elevate the whole building. That might sound good on paper, but that might not be, feasible in 99 years from an economic standpoint. So I think the department should either be really, cautious about giving license terms that are that prolonged, or I think the better option is to think about, could we include language in the regulations for like license reopeners? Like if you get a license that is going to be for 95 years, 99 years, honestly, even 65 or 70 years, can there be a provision in the license where if things substantially change and you have, for instance, your ability to comply with your license standards is changing because of things like sea level rise, can the department come back in and, require an amendment process, require a minor modification to ensure that the project can still, at a minimum, comply with the regulations? I'm thinking, if we've got really intense flooding 50 years from now on certain sites, is the majority, a portion of their required open space being flooded frequently or permanently? Is the, lateral shoreline access on their site being flooded frequently or permanently? Those are things that we may have to go back and revisit. And our kind of analysis of the current regs is that DEP, it's not clear what authority DEP has to go back in and reopen those licenses if that situation were to occur. So I guess my advice here would be to really consider that, and whether or not there needs to be some type of a reopener or ability for DEP to go back in and say, okay, we gave you an extended term license, things are not how we thought they would be, or you're not as prepared as you intended to be. And we need to go back and kind of rethink what the requirements for your site are.
Thank you, Deanna. That's I feel like I'm in a dissertation defense day for some reason. I don't know. Not that I have a PhD. This is a complex question. This is a very complex. The issues you raised are complicated, really, and I would not do them a service by trying to respond point by point. But I will respond in a little, and that is that 99 years is a very long time, and that's issuing a license for 99 years for a non-water continuous project. That's a significant thing, and I know that Anastasia is probably putting her hand up any second, but it's that's a long time. Things are changing. I acknowledge that. I know I've asked for many 99-year licenses in my time. I know, and I got a couple, but I didn't get a lot. That's a very important point, and these we're gonna have to consider all of this. And so, thank you. I appreciate that. I can't tell who was next.
I just wanted to respond to Deanna's comments. I agree with her 100%. I think that for a licensee should be required to demonstrate their ability in detail to comply for the full extent of their license, and then be required to implement portions, in a maybe not all at the very beginning. But she's absolutely right that you can't just say, oh yeah, we'll raise the building. Like, that's ridiculous. You need to be able to demonstrate that you have the capability to comply in the future. I also think we really need to untangle the whole financing thing, because if that's the sticking point, that's where developers get the idea that they need a long-term license from. I don't know details about that. Maybe others on the call do, but that's something to really figure out. Maybe it is just a fact that, as you alluded to, Daniel, that 99-year licenses for non-water dependent use projects just don't make sense anymore. And if, that could very well be the case. So that's all I have to say.
So I'm going to respond to that. Just again, the 99-year thing. The regulations allow for a 99-year license in certain circumstances. I'm not taking that off the table. We're not saying we're going to strike that. Okay. If we do, we'll all be the second ones to know. it is a significant thing to issue a license for 99 years. It's more complicated than it was in 1978 when this whole thing started, and 1990 when the regs got revised. It's much more, we recognize that it's much more complicated than we thought it was, than institutionally we thought it was. There are, which one of you haven't worked with an engineer and says, well, can you do this? And the answer is, I can build anything. How much do you want to spend? Right? So there are lots of solutions. The one I thought up in my head 6 months ago was, can you take the top course off and add something new? And that's just one example of some flexibility. And I do not want to limit the engineering community and the development community to come up with creative solutions that can achieve both of these goals or achieve many of these goals. So that's what I got for the moment on that.
Dan, if I could follow up, this is Rick Domino.
Sure, Rick, go ahead.
And I'm sorry if I'm jumping ahead of line. I can't really keep track. I apologize.
Nope, you are on deck.
Okay, thank you. I want to come back to the theme of simple and flexible. One of the things that you guys have had as a tool is the operations management boards for certain related activities associated with the relationship to the water sheet and facilities of public accommodation. And I agree with the point that Stephanie raised regarding financing and leasing terms, and this notion of what's ownership. And what's ownership is usually a longer term lease, and sometimes it can be, as you're suggesting, Dan, 99 years. If you want to come back and look at some things in intervening times, and again, I'm just thinking out loud, but you do have some flexibility regarding those operations management organizations that you've established in the past. And maybe that's a vehicle, again, to keep it simple and flexible for you to look at intervening regarding some physical or operational characteristics of the building over time associated with different changes of the environment and circumstances that might exist without necessarily limiting the licensing requirement and therefore kind of upending the notion of what ownership is, or what the lease terms are, or what the financing arrangements might be, or jeopardizing those financing relationships. So I guess I wanted to make that point, and again, to try to make that simple and clear. And also, you got to be careful because you can't really, change the foundation of a building because, something's changed. You have to kind of come up with maybe other strategies that might be more relevant and adaptable to that time. But anyway, that's point number one. Point number two is, and this relates to licensing terms as well as the earlier point, and I'm sorry I missed that agenda item, but you have, as you were saying, existing licenses, and getting back to the notion of simple and flexible. I have some colleagues that are associated with our board that would love to immediately take action to change the location of some of their vulnerable utilities, and but need some height approvals to be able to accommodate that. As Jamie was saying earlier, sometimes it could be a floor or more in terms of being able to accommodate some of these changes in the buildings that exist within your current licenses. And I would suggest that, again, you take a simple and straightforward approach to that regarding a license amendment or a licensing change, so that a current licensed Chapter 91 building owner and developer could come to you in this case, the city of Boston, and say, hey, look, I want to make my building less vulnerable, but I need some flexibility, but I'm stuck regarding the height restriction that was related to this Chapter 91 license, and also the height approval of the city of Boston. So I'm asking you to consider, both in terms of licensing terms, as well as the earlier question about utilities, some building in some proactive language that allows for more flexibility of folks that are interested in doing that, because it's a win-win. I guess wanted to make that point as well. And so I'll stop there and with those two suggestions.
Thank you, Rick. That we really do want to get out of the way of moving, utilities off the ground floor and things like, we want to get out of the way of that. And we're going to get to minor modifications in a minute. And that is something that we're exploring as to how that might happen. So I'm gonna not spoil that, but it's a very good point you raised, Rick, and it is something that we're thinking about. How can we further encourage building owners to do these things?
Daniel, we've got Jamie Fay,
Yep, I see that.
and I think after him, we can move on to the next.
All right. Rick, I encourage you and others to put some of this stuff in writing. Again, we're recording this, we'll put it on the website, but you all and your consultants and your teams are very good at articulating these things in writing, and that will facilitate the department in incorporating more of these suggestions. It really will. So I thank you for the comment. I'm pretty close agreement with you, Rick. Jamie?
Thank you, Daniel. I just, on this point, I think I want to encourage you to think a little bit differently about this particular section of the regulations. I think you're certainly bringing up a very important point that to the extent that a license term is extended, that the projected sea level rise should be considered for the length of that license. But that's not really what 915 is all about. 915 is about whether you can justify or not justify an extended term. And personally, I think that's a little bit different than conditioning an extended term. And I think really you can address this in 937, I think, very easily. And if you start to modify 915, you may find that there's a lot of controversy about that and a lot of pushback about the whole issue of how long, and you've heard some of that in the comments to date. I would encourage you to put this sort of the longer term issues to be addressed, and to think creatively about how 937 can simply say that you need to consider sea level rise for the design life of the building, and or maybe the license term if you want to address it in 937. But your bullet here sort of suggests, and I'm sure that's not what you meant, but the bullet sort of suggests you don't need to consider sea level rise if you have a 30-year term. I don't think that's what you meant to say, right? Aren't you saying?
You're probably right. We want to focus shorter live projects.
Yeah.
Have a whole lot less sea level rise to worry about. That's kind of the message here. Longer live projects, particularly extended term licenses. It's a much bigger item on the agenda to think about for a project and license.
So I think you can address that at 937 if you think creatively about how to do it, and you just need to sort of think through design life of a building as one standard for sea level rise or license term, or maybe both. I don't know, but it seems to me it's not really so much about the license term as the design life of the building, which could very easily be longer than the license term.
Mm-hmm. And let's not forget that the extended terms of that length need to bring with them, I think the term is extraordinary public benefits. So that's part of it.
But that is kind of, I guess that's part of my point is my project, if I design to 2070 or 2100 sea level rise, is that an extraordinary public benefit? Is that a reason to give me a longer term license? I don't think it is. So that's why I don't think this is the right place for what you're trying to do. I think you should look at 937 and say, every license needs to consider sea level rise, and the amount of sea level rise relates to either the license term or the design life of the building somehow.
And if we have to modify one less section of the regulations, Jamie, to achieve our goals, that all the better. And I see you have CLF's vote on that.
Just to be clear, no.
Sorry, my bad. Okay, sorry.
I do agree
My
with
bad.
Jamie that I think what he's saying makes sense, that if the goal is to make sure that people are considering sea level rise for the design life of the project, 915 is probably not the right place for that to be. I don't know that means that it's not worth looking at revising this portion of the regs, because like I said, I think the bigger issue for extended term licenses is that right now, if you issue a 70-year, 65-year license based on what the proponent has put in their application, there isn't a clear-cut way for DEP to go back in and revisit that if it turns out that they're not actually prepared for climate change. So I think attaching some type of a reopener provision to extended term licenses would make sense, and I think this is the place where it would go.
My apologies for taking a little motion on the camera to mean one thing or another. Sorry about that. Let's give I think Jamie's the only one with the Jamie Medea is the only one with the hand up. Jamie, if you'd like to.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Daniel. To speak extremely briefly, I'm speaking for the Massachusetts Marine Trades Association. All water dependent businesses, all need the water's edge. Excuse me. Just wanted to remind everyone that they need the financing considerations just as badly, if not more, than the non-water dependent projects, because they tend not to be as profitable and they have no other place to go. So please don't leave us under the table when considerations are being looked at. Unfortunately, the regulations are already dividing projects into entirely water dependent or non-water dependent. And I'll just make the observation that our members' docks and piers are often replaced on a cyclical basis anyway, sheer wear and tear, and they're extremely good at designing them for what their current needs are, because they have to watch every penny, and they're designing for whatever is the longest term that thing is going to last. So they do that with the docks already. The issue is the buildings. We would really like to see the buildings considered for longer term licenses, because they need them just as much as anybody else, and they too need to design them if they're designing new or adding to an old one to address projected sea level rise. They're no less interested than the non-water dependent uses. Thank you very much. Oh, and I was going to say, use the maintenance term. I put this in the chat, but rather than fuss and bother for a long time about how long you're going to do it, use the maintenance provisions in the licenses as your means in the future. If someone is not addressing necessary changes and they're putting health, welfare, the environment in danger, use the maintenance provision to require the changes. Thank you.
Thank you for the suggestions. Anybody else like to weigh in?
So
Again, this
Daniel,
is-
just a quick time check. We're actually doing great. So by my count, I believe we have 2 topics left. And we're scheduled to have the panel discussion go until noon, and then we take a break. So however you want to manage the time within that envelope, we can, circle back to another topic if somebody wants to. And there is never point deductions for completing a conversation early. So just
All right, well, I guess we'll move on to the next item, unless I see no objections.
I just wanted to,
Go ahead, Rick.
I just wanted to mention that the two Jamie's points are relevant and kind of reinforce what I was talking about in terms of keeping the parameters of a longer term license in place, but kind of finding different places within the regulation to I guess support the objective that you're having relative to being able to intervene or examine opportunities over the term of the license. And Jamie's point about the maintenance element of your regulatory process may not be a bad place. Of course, I was referring to the operations and management element of your regulations, but Jamie's point about the maintenance section may be more relevant. So anyway, I just wanted to reinforce those 2 points.
Okay. Yeah, these are all very good points about how do we keep up with sea level rise? How do we not have to design for 99 years from now? It's all, again, all very good points, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I guess I'm ready to move to the next one. This is a third rail. You all have heard me say in the past, this is used to be one of my favorite provisions of the regulations. Minor modifications are a useful tool, but we need to be very careful in how we use them. And I think you've all seen that we are being very careful in how we use them. They really are intended to be minor, to be insignificant changes in use, insignificant structural alterations, okay? De minimis is a really good word to be able to accurately, if you can accurately describe things as de minimis to be a minor modification, that is what we'd like to hear. The reason we put it on the slide here is not to open the door to a whole slew of new minor modifications, but rather to, again, facilitate potential climate adaptation strategies. The one that is at the top of our list, good or bad, is relocation of building systems. And maybe we should have brought, I can't remember that gentleman's name, the MVP. We want to get out of people, we want to not be in building owners' way so they can move their systems. Rick already weighed in on this as well. The particular item that we're, want to hear about, we want to talk about, is what happens if you've got your building systems on the ground floor, you figure out a way to get it to the roof or some higher level, regardless of what floor it's on. And that ground floor area is open. Now the ground floor can be reprogrammed. I know from the developer side, folks would, sorry about that. Owners would prefer to be able to lease that space out, to reuse that space for something else. And that certainly it can be construed as a change in use of that ground floor space. So we're looking for ways that we might be able to afford some flexibility here without violating the public trust, without violating the license, things like that. So that's what we're trying to do. I can no longer see all of you.
Are you ready for comment?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, Deanna?
Thank you.
So I'm trying to understand this a little bit. It's a little bit of a red flag for me. So the idea would be, because of the relocation of whatever the building systems are, there's now space on the ground floor for something else. And you're suggesting that a proponent would be able to undergo a minor modification, which doesn't include any public comment, to decide what the use of that space should now be. Is that what you're proposing?
That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah. I just wanted to be clear that I was understanding it.
Yeah, that's what I want to talk about. There are benefits to getting those building systems off the ground floor.
Right.
If let's say that the whole ground floor, kind of absurd example, the whole ground floor was building systems, and you're moving that whole thing upstairs. That's a lot of space. That's a lot of change in use. That's certainly an extreme farcical example, but how do we strike a balance to encourage building owners to get that upstairs?
So, yeah, so I would say a couple of things. I mean, I think one, this somewhat overlaps with the earlier conversation we had, right, about giving them kind of the height allowance they need potentially to relocate systems. I'm not sure I agree that the appropriate incentive for getting them to relocate systems is allowing them to unilaterally decide how they reprogram the ground floor. I think the built-in incentive for them relocating their systems is that they don't get destroyed if there's a storm, right? Like there is an inherent self-preservation aspect to relocating building systems. We should make it easy for them to do that by allowing them height allowances so that they're not being penalized. But I'm not sure I agree that, you know, having to go as far as to incentivize them by allowing them to reprogram ground floors without public comment makes sense. I think for me, the big issue here is how much space we're talking about. If we're talking about, you know, a utility closet worth of space, that's a very different conversation than if we're talking about, you know, an amount of space that could be leased out for some type of private use. I also think it depends. I also think it matters whether or not we're talking about private or Commonwealth tidelands. I would have some really serious concerns if for Commonwealth tidelands, we were allowing proponents through a minor mod process to unilaterally decide how to reprogram ground floor space without any public comment from the community. I don't think that that is in the spirit of the regs, and I would have some really serious reservations about that. But again, I think it really depends on the amount of space you're talking about. So maybe that's a built-in threshold is, you know, how much space is actually being reprogrammed. And also what type of tidelands it is and what else is on the ground floor. But so I would just kind of, you know, flag that and say, I don't personally agree that thinking of this as an incentive for building owners to relocate these systems makes sense. We want to make it easier for them to do that. I'm not sure that we should be talking about incentivizing them to do that because there is kind of an inherent incentive for them to do that.
Yeah, the Commonwealth versus private tidelands is a very good point. And also the size, I think that's important as well.
Okay, Barbara?
Thank you.
Sorry. In allowing other uses, if we provide that flexibility, that may run up against some other attempts under local zoning to try to prohibit another use that could just be damaged by flooding. And it would be a shame to say we have to protect these systems, but we're going to allow something else to be harmed by flooding and sea level rise. So I think there needs to be more of a process and looking at what that use would be, how it would affect the building, and how that, and for the communities that have already adopted zoning regulations like the coastal zone, coastal flood zone resilience district in Boston, it would not be possible to put certain uses on the ground floor. For communities that haven't adopted that, I don't know if it's the waterways role to determine what goes there, but it certainly is something worth looking at to make sure it's protective.
Okay. I'm having a technical issue here. I can't see anyone's faces.
Sorry, we've got
Kristen,
Rick.
go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So just as a quick point, I guess on the ground floor, the regulations has normally supported the notion of what's called facilities of public accommodation. And what's interesting about that particular regulation over time, and I was interested to see the agenda that you were considering, and I'm obviously clear and supportive of the idea of updating regulations that relate to sea level rise and climate impact. And I think that's, laudable for you guys to be examining this. But that's this particular point regarding the commercial uses of the ground floor relative to the relationship to modifications in a building relative to building systems begs this question about facilities of public accommodations in a way. And it almost warrants some consideration of that regulation as well, because over time, sometimes facilities of public accommodation haven't worked out, meaning economic circumstances and other leasing requirements have not necessarily allowed us to be successful in getting the full utilization of those spaces. So I think that's worthwhile to think about relative to this question. I also think the proposed amendment considering minor project modifications, again, you might want to be a little bit clearer there relative to the relationship to the question of height. Because one could argue that a height change is not necessarily a minor modification, but some of these will require adjustments in the height of a building, even if it's simply related to the building systems elements. And so I'm not sure how that would fit in, but I think if you're going to try to be a little bit more flexible and use this part of the regulation to accommodate it, you might need to reference the notion of height as part of the modification of a building. And then the last point I guess I'd make is you don't want to be too onerous regarding the public process if some of this is more simple than it is something that triggers something that may be more onerous regarding the public trust question. But I think maybe it relates to the point that was made earlier about how much square footage you're actually changing in terms of how public engagement you do. And whether the facilities of public accommodation requirement is being pushed by this question. But I do know that it's reasonable to consider that if a developer is going to be substituting commercial space to occupy now building systems, that in order to pay for that change and also to keep the building whole, that commercial space will need to be kind of located in another part of the building. So having some flexibility regarding the relationship to commercial space regarding a building systems relocation is actually very important relative to being able to finance these changes, as well as keeping the buildings pro forma in a place where it makes sense from a developer standpoint. So anyway, or building owner standpoint. So I guess I wanted to mention those points as relevant considerations as it relates to this particular question.
Yeah, it's thanks, Rick. It certainly is complicated, complicated question. I'm sympathetic to Deanna's comments about not doing too much without public input. You know, I know that is one of the concerns of the whole minor modification provisions to begin with. I do think it is a matter of, in some points, matter of the scale of this. If it is just a utility closet or something, that's certainly different and become multi-less.
We have a couple more speakers. We've got Chris Bush.
Yeah, just real quick, I think a more common consideration we may have, I think a lot of these building systems are also located in basements, which are very vulnerable and may not be able to flood proof. And there may be situations where we have, you know, property owners may want to elevate to a flood proofed elevated first floor in space that may be functioning for FPA. So I think that's another item we may need to think through as part of this. If, you know, FPA space, again, to Deanna's point of how much space is that, but again, to incentivize getting those critical building mechanical systems out of basement areas to some elevated area where maybe the roof is just not feasible, and that ground floor may be the only option.
That's a good point.
All right. Sorry. We've got Jamie Fay.
Well, Daniel, I think, you know, we've spent a good amount of time here talking about how Chapter 91 reg should be adapted to make sure we build new buildings the right way. But I think if we're really talking about how we move forward and make ourselves as a society and as a community adaptable, we all have to recognize that 98% of the issues are existing buildings, not new buildings. And this is the only provision really of your regulations that relates to existing buildings, because everything here is already built that we're talking about. And we're talking about how much of a modification can you make to an existing building before you trigger a very expensive, lengthy, time-consuming process to get either a new license or an amended license. And I think this particular item is really worth a lot more discussion, and trying to find ways to make it actually work better, so that we can achieve better resiliency for existing buildings. I think this is a land use planning issue, right? That everybody faces who's in the land use planning business. Is how do you adapt the process properly to the problem you're trying to solve? And I respect some of the comments that have been made here about the need for public involvement. I don't think anyone is worried about having public comment periods on a minor modification. I think the department certainly has the discretion to do that and has exercised that discretion in the past. So it's not an issue about whether the public gets a say or not. The public should have a say, but isn't there a better way for us to help make some of these minor changes? And I know, Frank, when Frank was at Salem, that was in a city planning office, you just deal with this stuff all the time. You have to, nothing is static, and you can't expect a project to be approved and not change for 30 or 50 or 60 years. They're going to come back and there are going to be changes, and you need to find a way that's relatively easy to approve those changes without an extraordinary amount of staff time and process that is a disincentive to actually make changes. I mean, these changes are good. So I would encourage you to think more flexibly about this particular provision to encourage climate resiliency changes. And that would include things like elevating buildings. I mean, if somebody wants to come in and raise their 100-year-old, wharf building by 3 feet or 4 feet, I would be fine with that. It's a minor modification, and yeah, give the public a chance to comment on it, but don't drag them through a 12-month process or longer just to do what we all actually think they should be doing, right? That everybody agrees should be done. So I don't know where to go with this one, but I think you should really, and you may want to add things like handicapped accessibility to the list as well, because it's kind of the same issue. People are trying to adapt their buildings to meet current codes and do it in a way that they don't have to spend a year and get a new license for. I think, handicapped accessibility, whether it's an elevator addition on a building or a new ramp, things like that, these are things we want for the public, right? We want the public to have access. So it's kind of in that same category of how you adapt existing buildings to current codes. And shouldn't there be a more streamlined process than a license amendment to get there?
Yeah. We do need to find a way. We do need to find a middle ground. I appreciate your comments about public comment on proposed minor modifications. That's one way to get public input. But we don't. We need to figure out how that might fit into. I mean, that's why we're here, right? We need to figure out how that might fit into the regulations, because right now, as you all know, the minor modifications provisions are very rigid, with very tight time frame, so that mechanism is not built in, nor is the time built into that. In the past, there have been voluntary extensions of the review period, and that's a bit of a delicate point legally. So we need to be careful how we do that, careful with all things, minor mods, right? So,
No, you don't have any other speakers waiting.
okay. Apologize for I got a little video here, snafu. I can see your faces now on the second screen.
So Daniel,
Steve,
we
yes,
have 5 minutes left scheduled and a couple more topics, so we might have to do a little dance here.
all right. Well, let's move to the next one.
Can I ask a quick question? There's no end time on any of the invitations we received to this meeting. How long should people on this call be blocking off for the rest of the day? I know we're doing a 10-minute break in 4 minutes, but just logistically.
We like to have interminable meetings, so I apologize. I think there's competing theories about putting end times on meetings, but essentially we were planning to go until 1. And so the idea in the initial slide Daniel showed, we was going to have the panelist discussion, then take a short break so everybody can do what they need to do, and then return and have a half an hour conversation that includes the attendees who don't appear on the screen, but there's 32 of them there. And then we would have a chance to do some wrap up. And that doesn't mean that the panelists aren't still participating in the attendees conversation. So, and then we were going to wrap up and finish at 1. So,
Okay. I would just say that several of the people who are viewing have dropped off, I'm sure, because of their own scheduling. So I know that this is kind of a different process, but maybe there can be an additional webinar or some sort of format where people can give verbal comments ahead of the February 25th deadline. This is a lot of information I think everyone on this call is getting, and I'm sure the attendees in the audience also want time to digest it, especially since many of the bullet points are being greatly illuminated by the discussion and given a lot of context. So just to throw that out there as a potential, just a future short, 1 hour opportunity for even more attendees or members of the public to provide comment.
Thank you. We'll see how the rest of this goes, and we'll consider that. Moving on to the next item, we're looking to kind of improve some consistency and between coastal high hazard and velocity zone. We want to maintain consistency with the wetland regulations. So, this is certainly might be the most technical of the items we're bringing up today. Who'd like to start? Maybe.
I don't know if I'm supposed to speak. This is Jamie Medea. My hand's raised.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, Jamie, go ahead. Jamie Medea.
Great, thanks. Thanks again for the presentation. Very illuminating discussion. On this particular point, I raised my hand to say only deep concerns. Want to see it in writing and compare the technical terms. We've been hearing from the Mass Marine Trades Association and seeing vast differences in velocity zones. Some are quiescent and some are high velocity. But our membership really understands their local conditions. They know what their local conditions are, and it's in their own self-interest to create their systems to be resilient. It is not in their self-interest to be unsure what's allowed and what's not allowed for what they can plan for. So we'd like the chance to look at what this consistency would mean and how it plays out in terms of what either modified or new structures are on land and what modified or new structures are in water. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Daniel, I don't see anyone else with their hand raised right now.
Anybody else want to jump in on this?
We've got Chip. Hold on 1 second. Go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, just a point of question, and I hate to go back to 933, but if they're required to comply with the Wetlands Protection Act, is this necessary in order to restate it in 9.02? 9.33 requires the projects must comply with applicable environmental regulatory programs, including but not limited to, and has a listing, including the Wetlands Protection Act. So is there a concern that there'd be an inconsistency in terms of having a separate definition, or I'm not sure what problem you're seeking to correct would be, Daniel?
Pam Harvey, would you like to jump in?
Or yes, this is just for consistency. There is a definition now of coastal high hazard area in the Chapter 91 regs and some references to it, and it just makes sense to have it's a very similar definition as now, so it won't change the outcomes, but it just seems, good to have it be used a single definition.
So Pam, this is Chip. So would you replace the existing definition with one that says it's consistent with the Chapter 13140?
Yeah, just replace the definition that's there now with the velocity zone definition in the wetlands regs.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what the inconsistency is, but I think we'd have to comply anyway. So I think it sounds like a no-brainer.
Yes. We do have brains, but that's right. It's a no-brainer.
Jamie Medea.
No, Daniel, sorry. Barbara is next in line.
Just felt like I was on counterpoint there for a second. Sorry, who was next?
Okay, I just wanted to flag that in creating a new definition that relies on the FEMA maps and references back to that, where creating more complications for moving towards forward-looking mapping. So, as we had just.
Yeah, someone reminded us that the federal statute requires FEMA to look backwards, not forward. So, yeah.
All right, we have Jamie Fay next.
So Pam, you mentioned that you want to make it consistent with the Wetlands Regulation definition. So what is the definition in the Wetlands Regulation? If you could just read that to us.
It's rather long, but it cites to the coastal high hazard area, and it begins with an area within the special flood hazard area that's subject to high velocity wave action from storms or seismic sources, and then goes on to say that the velocity zone is determined by the FEMA maps. So it's a little complicated definition, but it's very similar to the definition of coastal high hazard area. That the terminology is just changed a bit over time. It's really a technical change.
Yeah, but we all learn.
Yeah,
it matters. But I think I'd like to reserve comment until I see the actual definition in writing.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, and we also have Jamie Medea.
Thank you. I second Barbara's point. I've been teaching that the unfortunate aspect of FEMA is that it's backward, not forward looking, but I'm hoping there's changes with that. More to the point on the current Pam Harvey conversation. Thank you, Pam. I also second Jamie's observation. We need to see the technical description in writing because there's deep concern amongst water dependent structures that they're going to be quietly X'd out of the ability to remain in the only place that they actually can function. And they are quite skilled technologically at designing for high coastal hazards and high velocity zones, and yet being secure. I'm also going to become a lawyer for a moment and not just an advocate, and point out that legally there needs to be some economically beneficial use for a property, or the government is at risk for a regulatory taking. And the benefit of allowing water dependent uses in these zones is the government is no longer vulnerable to a regulatory taking. So I'm recommending for the self-interest of water dependent users and for the government's own interest to pay close attention in aligning any Wetlands Protection Act regulations and Chapter 91 regulations so that it is definitely still possible to have water dependent uses even in these areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. I know I don't see any other hands.
So I guess we're ready to take a short break. So Stephanie, Chrissy, we're at the right spot in the agenda.
Yes, pretty much. I think just to whoever raised that point earlier, let's make some expectations so people know what they're coming back to. So we were hoping to take a 10-minute break. Maybe we could make it 7, but whatever. Let's say if it's 12:05, we'll reconvene at 12:15. And in that remaining 45 minutes, we want to make sure that we open up the floor to comments and discussion from the attendees. We also had a section in there for any of you in this conversation that have raised any issues that feel more like longer term, bigger issues that are not going to be handled in this bite at the regulatory apple. Or if you have things that haven't been discussed, we just kind of wanted to like brainstorm those and get them out for future conversation. I'm not sure how much of that we've heard right now, but so we had some time for that, and then we were going to just do some wrap up and closing and remind you of the schedule going forward. So if we take a break now, just turn off your cameras and your mics, and we'll see you back here at 12:15.
So I understand we skipped a slide. Excuse me. I don't remember missing this one, but regardless, did we really skip the slide?
I recall we missed it, but we discussed the topic of what you consider projected sea level rise to mean. I'll just say licensed renewals, of course, should consider projected sea level rise. Thank you.
I think the discussion on this was, or where it sort of overlaps, was related to extended terms, and that was where some of the discussion on this concept occurred, but I don't think we did this specific slide.
Yeah. Well, this item really is in the theme of everything we've been talking about so far today, and that is particularly we want to start setting the expectation, if it's not there already, is that when a license comes in for renewal, that it's not just a rubber stamp. Yes, you can have what you had the last time. We have to consider how sea level rise needs to affect the design of that project, public access, etc. It's easy to say that. That's certainly perhaps more complicated in practice, but that's really the intent of this one. So if I guess would anyone like to speak on this topic? I can now see.
Okay, we've got Amy Medea.
Hello, I'll keep it brief. Of course, licensed renewals should consider projected sea level rise. It would be extremely helpful, though, for financing terms and people in the position of planning long-term for their facilities, what policy DEP might be able to put out that gives guidance on what is considered adequate for considering projected sea level rise. So it's not as indefinite as you could actually lose your entire license or be unable to occupy your building. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie.
We've got Barbara.
Hey, Barbara.
Hi. So if license renewals will consider sea level rise, would that provide the flexibility to make changes within that license to be more protective of sea level rise at that point? Because if the license was initially issued well before we even thought about these issues, would it be appropriate to address some of that? Elevating structures, elevating,
That really is the intent. That really is
Okay.
intent, Barbara, is to acknowledge that we're in 20, we're in 2022, whatever. Yes, but I don't want to issue licenses that ignore sea level rise.
At the risk of pushing this a little, pushing the envelope, would that go as far as, say, if there's a building and and they wanted to elevate the whole structure, but also create some kind of flood protection barrier, would that be considered? And if that barrier was going to be in the water, how would you be looking at that flood protection issue?
Well, the barrier in the water certainly does complicate it.
Yeah,
That's
it's not raised in this topic, but I think there's certainly room for clarification on flood protection structures and how those are treated under Chapter 91.
agreed. The reason we bring this topic up now, and in this forum, is to not miss it, to not create an inadvertent loophole, if you will, in the regulations. That's really why it's on the list right now. Jamie,
All right, we've got,
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I wasn't paying attention to who was first. So, Chrissy, who's next?
it's Jamie Fay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Daniel, thanks for putting this on the list. I will say, I think it's sort of like license terms as well. It's if the only change you're going to, I just think that there's a lot to the whole issue of extending licenses for another term, and sea level rise is probably only one of the many things that you would want to think about. I just think you're potentially getting into an area in which there is a lot of concern within the real estate community and the finance community about what happens when these post 1990 licenses come up for renewal. And I think it just might be a lot more complicated issue than just simply sea level rise. So, if somebody got a license in the late 80s or the early 90s, a 30-year term, and they're up for renewal. So what do? I mean, you have an existing, say, commercial building that's 10 stories or whatever. What are you expecting them to do to get a license renewal? To me, it's not terribly clear whether you're trying to force buildings to upgrade or accommodate people who wish to upgrade. Which is it?
Yeah, it's a tough question, Jamie. We're we do a little bit of both, right? We want to encourage folks to do it, and we want to facilitate those who already want to do it.
Well, I think it's certainly worth a discussion, and I'm sure it'd be a lively discussion, but with all of the other factors that go into the use of real estate and what cities and towns are doing with zoning and overlay ordinances and everything else, is that really something that we think DEP should be the leading edge on, given that your jurisdiction is not necessarily the same as floodplain jurisdiction, right? Especially when one takes into account future sea level rise. Or is this something which is, the reuse of existing buildings and adaptation of existing buildings? Is it maybe better driven by some other regulatory structure?
No, it's a good points all, Jamie. None of this is in a vacuum, right? Maybe we could rewind to one of Chip and Island's iterations of 9.33, I think. So worth discussion, worth consideration, worth being very careful how we step forward with this. That's for sure. This might be a good topic for folks who wish to submit written comments to opine about. And I thank you for the efforts that you all will probably put into those things. It's just going to help us move the ball forward.
All right, Daniel, I don't see any other hands raised.
Okay.
I think we can.
All right. Skip ahead. I'm going to thank Frank Taramina from my team for pointing out that we missed that slide or gone through quickly. I think Frank was the one. Maybe it was Chrissy brought that up. Thank you. Okay. Thanks everyone here. Don't leave. Thanks everyone for doing this. I really appreciate it. And we have, I don't know, I can't say how many, we have lots of people out there in the public. Thank you. 24 out there in the world. So let's have an opportunity for those folks to speak. Please raise your hand, I guess, if you want to. The audience, if you will.
Yeah, raise your hand and identify yourself because we can't see your faces. And Daniel's going to put up the slide that has all the 7 topics that we discussed.
Okay, we're going to start with Julie.
I'm honored and thanks, friends, for having this. It's been a really good discussion. The specific topic I put in, I also put it in the chat, if that's helpful, Stephanie, is the idea of like, let's make it easier to do living shorelines and other public co-benefits. It's much harder to do a sloped shoreline with some habitat values and some waterfront access values than it is to do a vertical seawall right now. And I think that there are some small changes we could do short-term, even before doing the long-term modifications that would make it easier to do living shorelines and other co-benefits.
Thank you. All right, we've also got John. You are unmuted.
Could folks, before the next person jumps in, could folks, if you have an affiliation that you'd like to identify that will help us, I don't know, get back to you, or for context, we would appreciate that. I think Julie Wormser was from the Mystic River Watershed Association. Is that correct? Kathy's nodding her head.
That's correct.
Sorry, that is me. Sorry about that.
That's okay, Julie. Thank you. Chrissy, I'm sorry, who was next?
John Monroe, I believe. Yeah.
Thank you.
You should be able to talk.
John, we can't hear you.
He's unmuted, but.
All right. So
I happen to know what his question is, if anybody would like me to repeat it.
Well played. Yes.
We'll just write it down as a question.
Yeah, it came to me by text from Don, who was reticent to say it because he saw my name on the panel. He says, you're anticipating making changes to Chapter 91, but how will those changes impact 310 CMR 10, the wetlands regs? In 2010, DEP Waterways got together with DEP Wetlands and came up with a joint design document called Small Docks and Piers. So I just read to you what he is asking. Oh, and he is with Coastal Engineering, a very experienced coastal design engineering firm.
I'm going to elevate this question to our division director, Stephanie Moore.
Yes, I thought you might do that. So, and I'm going to also invoke Pam and Kathy here as needed. So I guess first, it's a great question because the two sets of regs, waterways and the wetlands regs obviously have a fair amount of overlap. And so MassDEP is in the process of updating the wetlands protection regs as well, including introducing performance standards for land subject to coastal storm flowage. Now, that's always been a resource area, but it has not had performance standards before. That package has gone through its public process, and it has not been issued as a draft reg package yet for public comment, so you haven't missed anything. So specifically to your question about docks and piers, I'm not sure I understood exactly what the question was, but Jamie, if you could clarify, or maybe
I'm just
Pam-
going to
yeah.
I'm just going to guess that because he says there was a joint design document in 2010 of small docks and piers, a joint design document that was done in 2010 with both wetlands and waterways. I'm going to guess that he's hoping something like that comes out. Yes, he's texting me. He means a joint design document would be extremely beneficial. And I'm going to observe that you've mentioned there's been a thorough public process, but not a public comment. And I'm just going to observe that I think there are quite a few people who have not yet participated in these revisions to the wetlands. And we're very much looking forward to seeing the actual language to know whether or not there has been this kind of coordination. I hope I'm saying what Don Monroe had in mind. Thank you.
I will display my colossal ignorance, having only been at MassDEP 3 years thus far, that I am sure I'm sure this 2010 joint design document exists, and I appreciate the reference to it. Pam may have more familiarity with it, but I would say at a minimum, point well taken, and for sure we will look at any joint technical design elements that would overlap between wetlands regs and Chapter 91 regs for docks and piers. But Pam or Kathy, do you have anything to add there?
I'll just add that this is a great comment around implementation. And so for sure, during development of these brainstormy ideas that you've been reviewing today, they've been developed at the same time, concurrently with changes that are being proposed to the wetlands regs. So we have many of the same minds on both sets of regs at the same time, which is really helpful. And then in terms of implementation, I think you've raised an interesting idea. We should definitely take a look at that. We'll review the prior document. And we haven't yet developed a rollout plan for what we might do with respect to these reg changes. So great idea.
Don Monroe texts, thank you. Good answers.
Also, we'd be happy to hear from Don Monroe in writing, any thoughts, suggestions, follow-ups, etc. Are there any more attendees that want to speak? I don't see hands raised right now. There we go. Sarah, go ahead if you would please state your name and affiliation.
Sure, Chrissy. Sarah McCammond, the Harborfront Neighborhood Alliance. And I just wanted to circle back to one of the first proposed amendments that talks about projected sea level rise, and reiterate what I think is really important to also be taken into consideration, which is projected maybe storm water inundation. Because I know some of the planning processes that I've experienced within the city first looked at sea level rise, which is extremely critical, and obviously addressing our shorelines. But when we mix in having storms at the same time, that picture changes. And so I just would love to hear some more consideration of looking at both pieces when we look to at the existing regs.
Sarah, thank you for that. I think you and I and maybe Deanna or Alice Brown maybe have exchanged messages back and forth about actual versus projected tide elevations maybe in the 4-point channel. And I think that only drives that particular day, the water was higher than it was predicted to be by not a small amount. And that's an important consideration. I am not a hydrologist. I'm not a coastal engineer. I don't do those calculations, but that is something that I think we need to be certain that we're considering as part of that. You know, it's called storm surge, right? We need to be certain that we're not ignoring that in the sea level rise projections, which again, I don't do those calculations, but I think we need to be sure we're not ignoring that.
And then I just had a quick question that I probably should know the answer to. But in terms of license renewals, is there any public comment or participation in,
Yes.
license renewals? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that clarification. Answer.
Chrissy's muted, so I'll hop in. It looks
Yeah.
like Julie Wormser has her hand up. Again, Julie Wormser from Mystic River Watershed Association.
Thank you. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself before. Very good comments prompting other comments. I had also put in the chat newer research that does speak to our needing to be more conservative is that with sea level rise, you end up with higher groundwater levels, which also causes flooding from below. And we haven't even begun to think about that. So for sure, that's a longer term concern with this, but not one we can ignore. So if we could put that in the hopper for trying to figure out.
Thank you,
Hopper,
Julie.
meaning the longer term issues hopper.
Longer term issues hopper, but also I guess I would say if in the shorter term, you are saying be more conservative, be less conservative, the fact that we're not even addressing groundwater flooding yet speaks to weighing towards being more conservative.
Yeah, we're gonna have to be certain we have that. I will admit I haven't thought about how groundwater is affected by climate change. So I'm certain someone on this call will help educate me, and I guess we'll put that in the long-term list.
At the moment, there are no other hands raised among the attendees. Could change at any second.
Okay.
We could give it another minute. We also, I thought I just saw.
Somebody's
So I do see some panelists with their hands raised again. So if there's no objections, Daniel, maybe what we could do is take some more hands of erring on the side of the attendees, but then sprinkling in with panelists at the same time.
Yes, Sarah McCammon, were you just bringing your hand down? Or were you putting it up?
I thought you were going to panelists, so I didn't want to be rude, so I took my name down. Hand down.
Sarah, please go. We'll go back to panelists in a moment. So
just very quickly, maybe a longer term consideration is looking at ground floor FPA spaces and what the future of them is if those spaces are going to be consistently flooded.
It's like you're reading over my shoulder, Sarah. Yes, that is a very important item we need to address. And goes along with that is, what about the open spaces along the shoreline, some of which have some very hard fought and won battles regarding public access, harbor walk, etc. Those are definitely on the long-term list. And I look forward to figuring out how to deal with that. I don't want that great harbor walk to go away. That's for sure.
Thank you.
I think I can get Kathy Evans' endorsement on that. I can read into that. Head nodding. Thank you, Kathy.
All right, we've got Jamie Mateo.
Hello again, everybody. Mostly long-term, I'm kind of echoing Daniel. A lot of those open spaces are actually water-dependent use spaces. And they're non-water dependent use buildings that have simply left the water-dependent use zone as open space. And my request is to consider over the long-term period, the possibility of actually using those open spaces for water dependent purposes, especially if there's sea level rise. There's all the more ability to put docks or piers in those areas, or even places to launch small vessels. Just over time, there are ways to activate those spaces. And if they've become Commonwealth tidelands, or they already were, activation is more possible. So I offer that possibility for the long-term hopper, as Stephanie called it. The second thing is separate from water-dependent buildings and structures. Everyone might benefit, although we might not think so, from DEPs having a maintenance review period where you seek a maintenance submission to DEP every certain number of years. We often have requirements at the local level for, say, every 2 or 3 years, a dock or mooring needs to be inspected and you submit it to the harbor master or the local natural resources. Maybe DEP should be putting in the licenses maintenance reviews of the things that are subject to sea level rise and coastal hazards. Just observations for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kathy Abbott?
Yeah, really just picking up on, I think, one of Jamie's last points. We get, thank you, by the way, for having this conversation, for opening this conversation up to all of us. And he raised the issue of DEP's role today in all of this, and how might that be different than when Chapter 91 came into being, whether we're talking about in the 70s or the 90s. And we jumped right into short term as we get a little bit into that as we start to talk about long. But it strikes me that if DEP can do for resiliency on the waterfront what it's done for public access on the waterfront, then the citizens of Massachusetts and everyone will benefit greatly. It is true that the issues are different and the times are different. So a conversation at some point, either at the conclusion of this one or maybe at the beginning of the next conversation, looking at the longer term issues, to help to get a better understanding of what the outcomes are that the DEP is attempting to achieve, I think might be really helpful context for all of it. So thank you.
Thank you. We've got Sarah in the attendees. Sarah, it looks like you're still muted.
I think my hand was up from before. My apologies.
Oh. That's all I'm seeing for hands right now.
Do we want to open the floor up to suggestions for what needs to be on the long-term list? I know a couple of those just came up, but imagine that you were all doing this in person and we're in that conference room on the first floor of DEP at 1 Winter Street, and somebody's standing there with a whole pad of yellow Post-it notes and putting your ideas up on the wall. So that's kind of what I was thinking.
I'll just mention real quick, Stephanie Kroll has her hand up. I'm just going to unmute.
Go ahead, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one of the things that we need to look at closely is in section 912(2)A and allowing fill for the express purpose of protecting existing and proposed structures from current and future flood damage. There are a couple of water dependent uses in that list that come close to, but don't really capture the issue of sea level rise. So I think we need to look closely at that section.
All right.
We've got Jamie Fay.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I'd just like to second what Stephanie said. I think we certainly in our shop we have, and I'm sure others are seeing, you know, trying to achieve that resilient shoreline, living shoreline, is incredibly challenging. And I know that you guys know this, but your regs are not set up to do that, to help that, to encourage that, to support that, both on the wetland side and the waterway side and water quality side, to say nothing of other federal and local regulations as well. And you know, we ought to, just as we did with changing the regs to support some flexibility on some like offshore wind testing facilities and environmental restoration projects. I think it would be great if DEP could put together a team to tackle that jointly and see how you could better encourage, you know, more resilient, softer, nature-based shorelines, because it's just ridiculously difficult at this point in time to do that. And so it's a really discouraging factor. I find it hard to recommend to my clients that they do that, because it adds incredible cost, incredible amount of time, incredible uncertainty. And it's not required anywhere. They're just trying to do the right thing, and they actually get dinged for it. So.
Jamie, in terms of, you know, the comments that we're looking for now, I think it would be really helpful to have the specific conflicts that you're seeing relative to specific projects that, you know, that are being conceptualized. And that's across the board, that's from everyone, because where you're talking about, you know, facilitating that discussion, that's the kind of information that's good for us to have up front, so that we can come into the conversation really informed about what you're seeing as the issues.
Happy to do that.
Thank you. We've got another hand. We've got Julie in the attendees.
Hi, I have three long-term issues that I think are relevant to this conversation. So one is the idea of identifying the maximum sea level rise / chronic flooding concerns for existing infrastructure. Because I know we've been avoiding talking about managed retreat, but there's going to be some exponential increase in cost of trying to maintain the existing coastline. And we should have some marker. That could be a Stone Living Lab, that could be somebody's thesis, you know, but we do need to try to figure out this two-step of how do we shore things up today, and then what is the next step when we can't maintain this current coastline. And we need to start thinking about what do those regs look like, not just for the harbor walk, but for what we require private property owners and public property owners to do. A second thing that I think it goes along with this when we're talking about a changing coastline is to create a new state land designation of newly flooded lands to make it easy to do friendly eminent domain and have a place for those lands to go without a lot of hassle and without those lands being redeveloped and again in harm's way. So just as DCR is for conservation and recreation, we could wreck that acronym and add newly flooded to DCR. And a third one is that a lot of the climate resilience we're doing relies on a benefit cost analysis of real estate value, and that increases inequity between wealthier neighborhoods and lower income neighborhoods. And I'd love to see us really try to tackle institutionalizing, closing that gap in climate resilience, and relying less heavily on private investment to do shoreline resilience. Thanks.
All right. I know I don't see any other hands right now. Oh, nope, we do. Chris Bush.
Yeah, thanks. Just in thinking about long term, I mean, a lot of the emphasis, I think, has been today on sort of parcel and project specific issues related to licensing. But, you know, with the city's vision of sort of larger, broader district scale shoreline measures that are going to be needed in the long term. I think we need to be thinking about sort of regional and multi-property regulatory frameworks, be it, how we might develop, consolidated written determinations that cover a number of properties to facilitate necessary resilience measures. So just throwing that out there as another perspective or framework for longer term discussion.
Chris, I do think that the regulations now do allow for multiple property things. I'm thinking of the 4-point channel, right? That's kind of the flood barrier there. I'm not using the right term, maybe. That's going to cross several parcels, and there's certainly mechanisms to do that. And if it has to be done in a consolidated determination manner so that different owners have control or what have you, of different pieces, that's something we can certainly set up now to work with. But I think this does belong on the long-term list too.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we've got a couple more. Lisa Engler.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all. Such a great gathering of subject matter experts. Sorry I had to drop off for a little while, but I caught a really good discussion at the beginning and catching some good discussion now too. And I will definitely follow up with my DEP colleagues on the other comments that I missed. Just want to flag here as we're thinking about long-term and thinking about sort of bigger policy topics. I think a really critical component to this reg update process is making sure that we're maintaining the connections to the water that need to be there for purposes of specific uses related to water dependent industry in our designated port areas. So want to make sure that that's on sort of the long-term list, thinking about how we can provide flexibility in the existing regulatory framework to allow for these types of uses to maintain that water to shore connection over time. And it's going to have to be something that doesn't happen all at once, but over a longer time horizon. Also want to flag that CZM has been working on a DPA resilience project, and we piloted this project in 2 DPAs, Chelsea and Gloucester, over the last couple of years. We're hoping for that final report to come out this spring. And we're looking at it as a way to think about, again, this question about how DPAs and water dependent industry can continue to maintain the connection to the water, but also build in some resilience and adaptation for future sea level rise and coastal flooding as well. So be on the lookout for that. And thanks again for this really important and robust conversation.
Excellent. I think we have a couple more hands. We're gonna end on time here. So a couple more hands. If you could please try to keep it just a little bit brief, that would be great. And it'll give me a chance to just kind of wrap things up just a little bit at the end.
Okay, we've got Stephanie.
Hi, I just wanted to point out that in 2025, NOAA will be updating the tidal epoch, and there'll be a new high water mark. And this will impact the delineation of landlocked tidelands on the project shoreline. And so that's just something in the next couple of years that we're gonna have to figure out the specific implications and how to deal with that. Thanks.
I guess I'm probably not going to get that tidal epic book land on my desk. I was hoping for that, but I guess not. Chrissy, who was the last one?
That was the last one. I'm
That's
sorry.
the
Are
last
you?
one. Excellent.
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure if there was more.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay. Get to the end here. I got a goodbye slide. Okay, so this is not the end. This is not the last you'll hear from us on this. I really do want to see what you folks want to put in writing to help us shape these things. Many really excellent points raised today. I'm sure I'll replay the video, Friday night and Saturday night, late into the morning hours. But the best way, Pam's laughing. She doesn't know me as well as you think. The best way is really to kind of get some of this in writing to us, please. And we'll We'll look at every bit of it. And I would be shocked if we didn't reach out to a couple of you on your comments to talk about what, help explore the idea a little bit. Okay, no matter what that happens to be. And a lot of you know how to reach me anyway, so it's all good. Please send the comment letters to the Waterways programmatic email address, please. dep.waterways@mass.gov. That's the best way to do it. Please use the subject line, Chapter 91 Resiliency, so that we can more easily grab them, keep them, have to go looking for it and things like that. I don't want to miss it. Somebody's going to spend a lot of time on a comment. We don't want to miss it. So if you could please do that. You can send a hard copy if you'd like. Feel free. But the electronic is generally recommended, please, because all our office is open. We're not there every day. We hope to have draft regulations out in the spring for public comment. And then in the fall, final regulations. Are we going to change every one of those things we talked about? I don't know. We might, depends on the comments we get. We're going to take all this under consideration. So I did like Chip Nyland's suggestion about 933. I think we're going to look at, see what we should do about that. And a few others. So we really did record this so that to take the pressure off Frank Taramina, who's taking notes, but also so we didn't miss anything. So,
and Daniel, to that point, just that middle bullet there is we created a landing page for this. So that's where the meeting summary, that's where the recording will be posted. And so at least you'll all have one location to land on to find the materials.
Yep. We'll put it all there. So Stephanie, any last words?
Thank you. Really appreciate your input. Sorry we didn't put a meeting end time. That was a faux pas. We'll make sure to do that in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.